All right, first of all, I'll get the door here a sec. Thanks, everyone, for being here. What seems like a bit of a bizarre topic. When you see a sign next to the door that said, only men, usually people get a little bit nervous and have no idea what's coming. First and foremost, I was just on the road for 23 days in the U.S. doing pro-life outreach, so I'm kind of running on coffee. I've probably got enough caffeine in me to get a Shetland pony to run the Kentucky Derby. So if I do go talk too fast, please just tell me to slow down. Because this is a workshop, it's not a lecture, so feel free to put up your hand, feel free to interrupt, feel free to insert your own opinion at any point. That's always welcome, and it just makes for a more enjoyable discussion. So first of all, I want to start this presentation by saying that we're not here to talk about the women's side of this issue. It might seem like a bit of an ironic thing to say because it's often considered to be a women's issue, but the reason that I'm not addressing that is because I'm here as a man talking to other men. And what I want to take a look at in about the next 40 minutes or so is our responsibility, our role, where we've failed, where we've been successful, and where I really think we need to step up to the plate and start acting differently and start engaging differently. So I'm going to start the presentation by making what might seem... Oh, let Reverend Van Poplar come in a second.
Jonathan.
I'm going to start off the presentation by making what may seem like a very bold claim, but one that I've increasingly come to believe over the last few years where I've been doing public pro-life activism. And that claim is that I firmly believe that the abortion rate in this country could be cut in half overnight if all of the men stood up and took responsibility for their offspring, both born and preborn. I actually think the abortion rate could be cut more than in half, but in the meantime, I think that it is because of men to a large degree that the abortion rate is as high as it is. Now, that's often considered to be somewhat of a contentious claim, so I'm really happy that you're all giving me the opportunity to sort of parse that claim quite a bit further. In my mind, one of the main problems is that men have failed to be men over the last 3 decades. And there's a number of different reasons for that, but I think that that assertion stands up to all scrutiny. In today's abortion culture, we face a really schizophrenic duality. Essentially, men are both victimizers and they are victims. And I want to repeat that because it does sound like a fairly schizophrenic claim to make, but men in today's abortion culture are both victimizers and victims. So in this presentation, I really want to cover 3 main points. First, I want to take a look at how men, since the sexual revolution, have become victimizers. Second of all, I want to highlight how men, since the sexual revolution, have become victims. And the third point that I want to make is that we as Christian men, we as pro-life men, are called to reject both of these paradigms out of hand and live out what we read in the Scriptures, to live out the Great Commission, to fulfill the role of the Good Samaritan, to stand up for the helpless, to defend women and children in this culture. So first, men as victimizers. This is probably one of the most self-evident trends, but at the same time, it's one that I think needs to be delineated very carefully, because I have to say that whenever I write an article detailing the responsibility of men in the abortion culture, I get all sorts of emails and messages complaining that I'm really not taking the feminist responsibility into account. I'm of the quaint view that men should take responsibility for our own actions and not pass the blame off to Eve, if you will. So I'm going to be detailing in great detail exactly how this works. So first, hookup culture. Who here has heard of this new phenomenon called the hookup culture? Pretty much everybody. Can somebody tell me what you've heard about it? Just a quick description.
No strings attached.
No strings attached. It's the one that I hear almost every time. Yes, essentially, hookup culture, which is now very prevalent on university campuses, is the idea that you can have casual sex with no strings attached, friends with benefits, without any consequences whatsoever. When I went to Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, there was actually a bingo game on the back of the newspaper that I wrote for, called the Campus Hookup Bingo Game. And apparently there were some people who had completed the whole thing. It was just detailed various places you could take a girl to have casual sex. What shocked me was not so much that such a chart would exist, but how cavalierly everybody treated it, as if this was a totally normal thing to act in a way that I could only describe as predatory. But to really delineate what's happened in our culture over the last 40, 50, 60 years, we have to start where it all began, which is the sexual revolution of the mid-60s to mid-70s, and now, of course, extending on into the brave new world that we currently inhabit. Now, the sexual revolution of the 60s promoted a concept called free love. Now, I think that it's self-evident to anybody that the concept of free love is bizarre. Nature teaches us that there is no such thing as a free lunch. We know that for every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction. So the entire idea that we can engage in casual sex without consequences is one that is obviously ludicrous, but has been wholeheartedly and fully embraced by the culture that we currently live in. Just to go through a few consequences of the sexual revolution, which we're now in 2014 seeing in full bloom. We have 25 new categories of sexually transmitted diseases to deal with. And note here that I said 25 new categories, not 25 new diseases. Prior to the sexual revolution, there was two main diseases to worry about: syphilis and gonorrhea. Since the sexual revolution, we've got 25 new categories of sexually transmitted diseases, many of them incurable, and a number of them even lethal. So I don't think that any objective person taking a look at the scientific evidence, even if you're not a Christian, can claim that this whole idea of free love has panned out in any way. The second thing that we see is an unimaginable emotional toll that it has taken on men and women. This is something that I don't think we can just ignore, because it's very, very important. The sexual revolution has actually sparked a gender war between, as C.S. Lewis would put it, the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve, and has placed people at great enmity against each other, because instead of doing what's best and sacrificing for each other, instead, since the 60s, we've been heartily engaging in seeing how much we can get with, as the gentleman pointed out, no strings attached. And the final consequence, so this is just a few that I'm listing, but the one we're here to talk about today is abortion. Since the sexual revolution, we have seen almost 60 million preborn children in North America get decapitated, dismembered, and disemboweled. The biggest lie you'll hear in universities is that the sexual revolution was about free love. We take a look at the sexual revolution and we think it's different than, say, the Bolshevik revolution, because the sexual revolution wasn't bloody. That's not true. The sexual revolution in many ways is a higher kill count than any other revolution engaged in. Come on in, guys. I think Pastor Douglas Wilson of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, put it best. He said the hippies of the sexual revolution said they wanted to make love, not war, but it rapidly became self-evident that they were willing to do both. Now, just because when you walk in through a door that says only men allowed, I just assume that you guys all know we're going to talk about all the controversial issues in one shot. I want to take a quick look at contraception, because one of the things that has happened since the sexual revolution, one of the things that has enabled men to be such victimizers in our culture, is that they have developed this belief that they have the right to non-procreative sex. And our culture has seemed to literally forgotten that sex makes babies. Now, I would not have believed this a couple of years ago, but I spend a great deal of time debating university students on campuses, debating high school students at high schools, discussing issues of abortion, and you wouldn't believe the things that I hear. I kid you not, I had one guy walk up to me on a university campus and say, "Well, what happens if I get my girlfriend pregnant by accident?" What do you mean by accident? Did you trip and fall? I think you know how that happened. When you're engaging in the act of reproduction, you don't have the right to appear surprised when a new human being shows up. I had another guy come up to me and literally say, I got my girlfriend pregnant, I don't know how that happened. I was like, so did the public school fail you really, really miserably, or are you just being intentionally thick when it comes to basic biology? This would be funny if it wasn't for the fact that they're killing the child they didn't know would show up. This education, this lack of education, turns lethal very, very quickly. I have to continually remind people when they say, well, you know what, it was just recreational sex. Do you have recreational organs or reproductive organs? Because I never heard I had recreational organs, so that means that if you're engaging in sexual activity, you're using the reproductive organs. If you reproduce, you have no right to be shocked. Unfortunately, for the child that often results, these guys do appear shocked and are often willing to do whatever it takes to ensure that that child never sees the light of day. Now, just a brief proviso here, I am not in any way stating that men were more responsible for the sexual revolution than women were. The radical feminists fully intended to cut men out of the equation, to undermine the roles and responsibilities of men. They fully intended to castrate real masculinity exactly how they have successfully done. But that doesn't change the fact that men have fully taken advantage of the sexual revolution and used it in an extraordinarily predatory, and if we look at abortion, I would even say carnivorous fashion. Because it's undeniable to say that women have suffered far more as the result of sexual revolution than men have. This is simply basic biology. This is the chemicals, the bonding chemicals that are transferred even during sexual intercourse have a much, much firmer holding power over the woman than they do of the man. Dr. James Dobson, who I assume you've all heard of, has said that the sexual revolution is the biggest joke men ever played on women. They convinced women that they played the game too, and now the shame that was associated with men trying to take advantage of women, trying to so-called seduce women, trying to get into bed with them, was removed because the men had convinced themselves that it wasn't being predatory because the woman plays the game too. Once again, I'm not saying they never do, but this talk is just for men. I'll let a different speaker address the female side of things. In fact, I recently saw an article in Time magazine called "The Hookup Culture Hurts Men Too." Now, what I found fascinating about that particular title is that the secular culture has been ignoring the fact that the hookup culture is very damaging for a long time. But when you say the hookup culture hurts men too, what are you implicitly admitting? You're implicitly admitting that it's obvious that the hookup culture hurts women. They gave away that they knew their position was garbage just by the title that they put on their article. Now, the expectation, as I said, of non-procreative sex has created an enormous disparity. It's basically split the man off from the child. So many times I have debates and he's talking about her problem. It's not her problem, it's your child. That child shares the DNA of both parents, and both parents have equal responsibility for that. But what we have is men expecting non-procreative sex and willing to kill if that doesn't work out. Now, a lot of times when I write these articles about this type of thing, as I've mentioned before, I get men saying, come on, it's really not that bad, you're really exaggerating. So I've taken the liberty of actually bringing to your attention a few quotes from various blog posts written by men's rights advocates and people who advocate for this new concept called bro-choice, which is exactly as disgusting as it sounds. Bro-choice. It's as illiterate as it sounds too. Have any of you heard of the manosphere?
What?
The manosphere. Okay, nobody's missing anything. I'm glad no one's found it yet. It's this dark underbelly of the internet where only men get to hang out and confirm every single negative stereotype of men. They essentially hang out, they make misogynist jokes, they make rape jokes, guys exchange advice on how to hook up with girls properly. And on one of the blogs, ironically titled The Return of Kings, a man writing under a pseudonym, which I found interesting, and referring to himself as Bacon, which, as you'll see from his quotes, roughly translates over into dead pig, wrote an article called How to Convince a Girl to Get an Abortion. And here's what he says. He says there's 3 methods you can use to convince a girl to have an abortion. The Hail Mary, and you'll excuse the language, asshole method, and the, quote, wild card method. In the first, Mr. Bacon writes, the, quote, man should tell the girl in the sweetest way possible that if she has the abortion now, you'll be able to plan your lives together so that everything is perfect. Then, after she agrees and has the abortion, dump her and run. That's his first plan for convincing a girl who's had the unfortunate experience of sleeping with him to abort the baby they conceived together. The second method is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Tell the girl that you won't stick around if she has the baby. Push really, really, really hard and make sure that you keep your emotional face really stern so she knows you're serious. The second she agrees, get her in your car, take her to the clinic, and get rid of the baby. So you can clearly see that these men have about all the charm of a date rapist. The third method, the wild card method, essentially details lying like a psychopath until she caves. So this is an article that I thought this article was satire because I couldn't believe that something that I routinely accuse men in the culture of would just write blatantly out there. But no, we've gone from being ashamed of it to straight up writing it out. Another thing that I've often said is that men will only enter into relationships if there's the expectation of non-procreative sex. And how many of you saw the story about the abortion contracts a couple of months ago? Well, there's this new phenomenon out there that there's people like one of these famous NBA basketball players, and it turned out that he was dating girls, but they were signing an abortion contract ahead of time, which meant that if a pregnancy should result from the relationship they had, she was signing off, agreeing to go to the abortion clinic. And when I first read this, I thought it was an outlier, and I thought this was ridiculous until I started looking around the internet a bit and discovered that magazines like The Atlantic and stuff like that were saying this might not actually be a bad idea. So we're having a sort of cultural acceptance of the most bizarre and ridiculous concepts. By the way, the same writer that I just mentioned, this Bacon fellow, actually has another article just basically detailing which cocktails you should feed a girl in order to get her back to your house to sleep with you. So you can see that he has the moral character of a concentration camp guard, but it's just unbelievable that people are actually willing to so blatantly put it out there now. This is not just restricted to blog posts, and it's just not restricted to guys who are threatening to walk away, guys who act like real jerks. This is extending very much into the area of physical coercion. How many of you have spent a full day in front of an abortion clinic? Yeah. I have spent a number of days in front of abortion clinics, and you'll probably be able to agree with me on this. It is unbelievable to see how many fathers, boyfriends, husbands are hurting their daughters, wives, girlfriends through the door of the abortion clinic. Sometimes physically, often verbally abusive. Now just think about it. We can only see the people who are willing to publicly be abusive. Imagine what's happening behind closed doors for the rest of the girls walking into the clinic. There's a new study that just recently came out. You can look for it on Life News if you want, that basically made two main points about coercion. One, intimate partner violence, including history of rape, sexual assault, contraception sabotage, and coerced decision-making was associated with abortion. Point 2. Women in violent relationships were more likely to have concealed their abortion from partners compared to women who were not victims of violence. So we see that with a huge number of abortions, physical coercion by the man to the woman is involved. Now, I want to bring one other thing to your attention because it sort of clicked. I've been doing street activism and stuff for about 6 months, where we basically get out there with our graphic images of what aborted babies are, and then we engage people in discussion, and we have the joy of seeing so many hearts changed, minds changed, babies saved. It's just a wonderful experience. But we always really analyze the arguments that we use and how they work and how good we do at reaching out in love and convincing the person to be pro-life. So as I was analyzing the arguments we used, I started to notice a pattern in what the girls were saying to me. And they kept on saying one really interesting thing. They always say, but I couldn't raise a baby on my own. I couldn't raise a baby on my own. When I started thinking about it, I suddenly wondered why it was a foregone conclusion that they would have to raise the baby on their own. Why is this underlying assumption that if I am to get pregnant, I will have to raise this baby all by myself? Either the guy that they're with has stated this previously, or there's just this new cultural acceptance that men will not be men will not be fathers, and men will walk away when the women need them the most and when their responsibility is demanded of them the most. It's unbelievable to think that this attitude has seeped into our culture to such an extent that dozens of girls will say things like, I can't raise a baby on my own, with just the basic assumption in place that the man that they're sleeping with or married to or dating is just not going to stick around to take care of that child. Which leads us directly into one of the most grotesque intellectual phenomenon that I've seen most recently. That's really saying something, because I don't know if any of you follow left-wing academia, but they work very hard to come up with very bizarre things to say, because after all, they've got to keep the publishers interested somehow. But how many of you have heard of the concept of forced fatherhood? Nobody. Well, I'm glad not everybody's heard of it yet, but it was covered in the New York Times, Slate magazine, and increasingly in a number of other mainstream publications that are covering this idea that because women have the right to abort their children, men should be able to say no to child support and should essentially be able to tell the woman to have an abortion if he doesn't want to be a father. Now, there's an academic named Lori Schrage who's really been working on that. And let me give you a quote from the New York Times article reviewing her work. Quote, "Many of my male students who come from low-income immigrant communities believe that our punitive paternal policies are aimed at controlling their sexual behavior." By punitive paternal policies, she's referring to the fact that they have a paternal responsibility by virtue of being the father of a child developing in the womb. And these punitive paternal policies she's referring to, she goes on in the article and talks about how these people come from low-income homes and immigrant families, and how are they ever going to afford to pay for all the babies that they had from sleeping with all of the women they didn't actually love enough to marry, or like enough to have children with, for that matter. It's really a really heartbreaking trend. See, this is where it's going. We're now talking about how saying that men have to support their own children is a punitive paternal policy. Just the basic recognition of biological reality. This is how far we've come, and this is why I think many men on university campuses are becoming so predatory as well, is because we have intellectuals like Lori Schrage who are actually recognizing the self-pitying garbage they spew out as valid. I want to address one final way in which I believe men have become victimizers, and a way that has intimately affected the way the pro-life movement operates, and I would argue how the church and other nonprofit organizations operate as well. And that is the use of pornography. Now, often people say, well, how can you highlight a connection between pornography and abortion? I've been working on this for quite a few months now, trying to find out why it is exactly that so many men feel they can't join the pro-life movement, why so many men aren't standing up and fighting, why so many men aren't taking responsibility for their neighbors and fighting in the culture. And then I started doing presentations on sexuality and pornography, and I had friends come forward and talk to me about how they struggled with pornography, how they felt they couldn't break free, how it made them feel ashamed, and how it basically made them feel like they had been castrated and they could no longer live out the calling that God puts on all of us as men. And then I looked at the statistics. 64 to 68% of young adult men are using porn every single week. An additional 17% of men are using porn 1 to 2 times a month. What does this mean? It means that if you're not looking at pornography in 21st century North America, you are a minority. And it means that many people that you know are looking at pornography. It means that you might be. It means that members of your family might be. I have lost the ability to be surprised by people coming to me and sharing what they're going through, what they're struggling with, and asking for my help, because I've realized this plague has affected almost everybody. That is not an excuse. It's just a statement of reality and what it looks like right now. And one of the reasons I think pornography is so intimately connected to the pro-life movement is, first of all, it deprives the pro-life movement and the church of men willing to be men, because they're so wrapped up in their own demons and they're so wrapped up in their own shame that they don't feel like they can actually come out and take a stand. Number two, if you're willing to dehumanize women, you can dehumanize children. If you're willing to sexually objectify the person you can see, you're very, very easily going to be able to objectify the baby that you can't. If women are sex objects, it's very easy to call the fetus a clump of cells. I found this more and more and more in front of high schools. I was trying to figure out why so many guys didn't care. Even when I tried to appeal to their masculinity, say, you have to stick up for your classmates. You have to stick up for the girls in your class. And I was trying to figure out why they didn't care. Why so many of them didn't. It's because, based on the statistics and based on things they themselves have told me, they're looking at pornography. They know what it's like to dehumanize somebody. They know what it's like to be sexually cannibalistic, to essentially consume another human being for their own good, because they're looking at pornography. And it's progressing too. I recently wrote a paper called Personalized Pornography, where I detail the rampant sexting that's going on. Sexting is essentially guys asking for photos of female acquaintances or friends, naked photos. They're going one step further now. Instead of just dehumanizing and sexually consuming women they don't know, they're actually taking that step over and objectifying and consuming women that they do know. This is an enormous problem, because pornography is at the very root similar to abortion, in that it dehumanizes a human being created in God's image with a soul for eternity, turns them into a one-dimensional sex object for our consumption and our pleasure. Jesus Christ sacrificed his life for his church to show us what a husband is supposed to do for a wife. Pornography is the exact reverse of the gospel, and that it means that we are consuming a woman for our own sexual pleasure without any regard to the fact that she too is a human being created in God's image, that she might be the victim of sex trafficking, that she might be being abused by the porn industry, that she might have entered the porn industry out of desperation, that she might even be dead. The number of porn stars that are out on the internet now that are actually dead means that there are thousands of men lusting after women in pictures that are already dead. Think about how sick and morbid that is just for a moment. The pornography problem is intimately connected to the pro-life movement in those two ways. It denies us activists who are willing to be men, who are willing to stand up for women and children because they feel either too hypocritical, too guilty, or too ashamed. And we have a connection between the dehumanization of women in our culture and the ease with which people can dehumanize the child that takes residence inside the woman for 9 months. I'll move on to my second point now, which is men as victims. Am I talking too fast for anybody, just before I go further? All right.
You can blink every once in a while.
So, I've gone through men as victimizers and kind of really broken down where I think men have failed our culture. But now I'm going to briefly take a look at men as victims. Now, how men are victims is what I alluded to briefly before, in that it was very much planned by the Betty Friedens and the Gloria Steinems and the other third-wave feminists, that they wanted to cut men out of the equation, that they wanted to undermine the role of fatherhood. They wanted to undermine what biblical masculinity was. They wanted to undermine our value and our contribution to society, because they knew if they cut us out of the equation, they could more or less do whatever they wanted to. And this is third wave feminism. So when people ask me if I'm a feminist, that really depends on what you're asking about, right? The first wave feminists just fought for the woman's right to vote, which I was fully on board with. But you go on to the third wave feminists, and they're claiming that women are the same as men, and that simultaneously somehow they have to kill their children to be equal with men. And it takes a left-wing philosophy professor to unravel that one, but they seem to have managed to do it somehow. They were told that they had no opinion. Men were told they couldn't say anything. How many of you have ever heard the phrase, or had it yelled at you, that no uterus, no opinion?
No what?
No uterus, no opinion.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's all sorts of lovely things that we get tossed out at us all the time. There's no uterus, no opinion. Most anti-choice leaders are men, which I don't know if you've seen the organization I work for, but is absolutely not true. Talk to me when you can get pregnant. And essentially what the feminists have done now is say that you can only address the abortion issue if you're willing to voice your vocal support for the killing of our own children. That you don't have the right to say a word unless you're completely supportive of the abortion status quo as it stands. And I'll give you one example of this, because I always wonder if the pro-choice writers know how they sound when they're read aloud. I always think they might write a little bit differently. But how many of you have heard of Joyce Arthur of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada? Almost everybody. Now, she writes a lot of pretty crazy stuff, but most of the feminists packed up and went home after 1988. When they won. So now she's sort of like a lone voice crying in the feminist wilderness, so you kind of have to read what she's writing. And she always said that men had no say. We weren't allowed to say anything about abortion. But when I was actually on tour in 2012, going across the country with my colleagues doing pro-life outreach, she decided to post an article talking about how men should stand up and take a role in the abortion discussion. So I clicked on it to read it, and here's what I read. Quote, "For every single woman who's ever had an abortion, there's a man somewhere in the story." It's nice for them to notice that once in a while. "For every woman who was able to delay motherhood until a better moment, or improve her existing kid's chances by not enlarging her brood, or end a pregnancy that was doomed to end in tragedy and pain, there's also a man out there who is not a father today, or is a better father to the kids he has, because a woman he was involved with had the means to make this decision. The reality in American politics and culture is that our national discussion around this issue won't materially change until men understand just how invested they are in this issue, and then stand up with us to insist that our reproductive rights be protected and preserved." Now, I would argue that, as I pointed out in my Men as Victimizers section, that men are very well aware of just how invested they are in this issue, which is why so many men show up at pro-choice protests. My favorite one was actually a guy came to protest one of our displays, and he was holding a sign that said, "My uterus is my private property." So I strolled by him and assured him that I wasn't going to impose anything on his uterus, and he skidded off to get a new sign. That's when you can really tell that they don't read what they're actually holding. They just get it handed out by the organizers. But if you look at what this article is saying, that you can only speak out if you're pro-abortion, and if you look at this article now, it's suddenly saying, well, wait a second. It's interesting this is an American article because pro-life support's been going up every single year in the U.S. since Gallup started taking the poll. Support for pro-choice has gone down so far that Planned Parenthood won't even use the term anymore. So the pro-choicers are getting worried and are saying, okay, well, we're losing a lot of support. It's time to scratch out the no uterus, no opinion signs and get some deadbeat dads for dead babies signs out, because now we need the men, as long as we're just supporting the killing of our children. Now, there's a number of ways to sort of address the ridiculous claim that we can't say anything. One of the things that I usually do when I'm debating on the streets, if a woman comes up to me and kind of screams like, "You're a man, what right do you have to be here?" I always say exactly what I started this presentation with. I'm here because I believe that the abortion rate would get cut in half if men stood up and took responsibility. And that usually disarms them pretty quickly, and I can actually have a really good discussion with them about her responsibility. It's amazing how much you can accomplish if you take responsibility for your own stuff first. If you take responsibility for what we are demanded to do first, suddenly other people are willing to talk about their responsibility too, because they see a consistency there. Another argument I have, if I'm just being yelled at by a guy, usually on a campus, is I always ask them if arguments have genitalia. Why is my lack of a uterus or my possession of male genitals have any bearing on whether or not my opinion is right or whether the science I'm presenting is accurate? It obviously doesn't. Another example I always use is I'm not African American, yet I oppose racism. Do I have the right to do that just because I've never experienced that type of racism? That's obviously not true at all either. Another thing, I used to work with a number of Jewish organizations in university, and I won one award from B'nai B'rith Foundation for fighting anti-Semitism through writing. Now, I'm not Jewish, and thus have never experienced anti-Semitism. Does that mean that I don't have the right to fight injustice as I see it happening? And the answer to that, of course not. And of course, if you want to be flippant, you can always mention that you're a former fetus and so are they. Now, we have a second way that men have been victimized, and that's just that I'm talking now about guys who don't want their girlfriends to have abortions at all, who are not coercive, who are not abusive, who are not aggressive. I'm talking about the men who are timid and have bought the lie that they have nothing to say. And their girlfriend, their wife, walks into the abortion clinic and gets an abortion, and he'll never say a word because he doesn't feel he has the right to say so. One of my colleagues said she can't count the number of girls who didn't have an abortion that they were planning to have because even just a male friend stood up and asked them not to have it. But we unfortunately have this situation in which many men feel they have no right to say anything, even if they don't want her to have an abortion, and thus have been cowed into silence by feminists and what they've told us to do, which is essentially remain quiet. Essentially, they've obeyed the demands of people like Gloria Steinem and Joyce Arthur. The third way men have become victims is the men who do stand up and fight for their children but fail. I have one friend in university who was always pro-choice until his partner got pregnant. And he immediately knew that that was his child, that child was alive, and that abortion would be killing that child. But this woman didn't want to have the baby and decided to have an abortion. He told me that he got down on his knees and begged her not to go to the abortion clinic, and she did anyways, and he lost his baby. This is a way in which men have been victimized, and so many men have been left standing out in the cold while their girlfriend, their partner, goes into a clinic and aborts a child that's half theirs, because in Canadian law today, men have no say whatsoever. This is something that has been inflicted upon men and is not the male responsibility for. This story has played out again and again and again, and I've met a lot of men who are broken by the knowledge that they had a child, but that child ended up in a trash can behind some abortion clinic that probably had the gall to call itself a woman's health clinic. To sort of paraphrase C.S. Lewis, what has happened with the sexual revolution and men as victimizers and men as victims is that the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve have gone to war with each other. The gender wars are a real thing with a real kill count. And it's getting close to 60 million preborn children decapitated, dismembered, and disemboweled. This is not something we can afford to ignore. It's not something we can afford to not take seriously. So that's my second point, is men as victims. And now I'm going to move on to the third point because I really want to have time for discussion after this. And that is that as Christian men and as pro-life men, we are called to reject both of the paradigms I just went through. We are called to reject the paradigm of victimizer, and we are called to reject the paradigm of victim. We are called to stand up for those who are desperately in need of our help. And I know you've been to a lot of presentations today, which I think very eloquently made the case that there is no segment of the population in today's North America that needs our help more than preborn children. The youngest human beings in our society are being killed in this country at the rate of about 266 every single day. When Jesus tells us that we have to stand up for our neighbor, when Proverbs tells us to deliver those that are being drawn unto death, when the Psalms tell us we have to give our voice to the voiceless, it's impossible to find a candidate that demands our help and that fits those descriptions better than the preborn child today. We're kind of stuck often in today's culture because we've got the church saying it's a political issue, and then we've got the government saying it's a church issue, and right in between we've got a no man's land full of corpses because nobody wants to touch this issue at all. And in the meantime, we've got babies that are dying by the hundreds of thousands because people say that's a government issue. No, Jesus said to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's because the coin he was holding had Caesar's superscription. When the government funds abortion, whose image does that child bear? Caesar's or God's? Those children are creating God's image, not Caesar's, and thus the government is taking and funding something that does not belong to them, it belongs to God. And that correlates directly to our responsibility to defend those children. So just a few ways in which I believe that we as Christian men, as pro-life men, have to stand up and do a better job of fighting in our culture. And the first one is that we are called to live a sexually chaste life. We are called that first and foremost because the Bible tells us to, and because we are responsible for treating women with respect. Just from a really brutally pragmatic pro-life perspective, if you are having sexual relations outside of marriage, you do not have a context in which to bring a child, you have no right over that child if the girl you're with gets pregnant. You could be to a degree responsible for the death of a child, because if you get her pregnant, even if you don't want her to have an abortion, she might have one anyways because you have no power whatsoever over that child's life. The only way you can ensure that your offspring is safe in the cultural landscape of today's sexual revolution is to remain abstinent until marriage. More and more I see the connection between these two things. These heartbreaking stories I hear from men whose girlfriends walked into the clinic and have an abortion shouldn't have happened if they had just listened to the scriptures and they had lived out their sexual lifestyle in the way that God laid out. God gave us the context in which to have children. But I do want to add to that if you make a mistake, and it happens, we all know people who have made mistakes. I've got friends and relatives who have made mistakes. If that happens, you have the right and the responsibility to do everything you can to ensure that your child is safe. I am sick and tired of having guys come up and say, well, what was I supposed to do? Beg? Yeah, you were. You were responsible for your children. And if you're too much of a man to get down on your knees and beg for the life of your child because pride got in the way, that is something that I think is really, really distasteful. You have to do everything in your power to save the life of your child, up to including getting down on your knees and begging for that child's life, because your pride, your lifestyle, any cost to you means nothing at that point. There's a child that is your child, creating God's image, that is about to be sent into eternity if you don't do something. I often think about abortion in that context, is that God uses acts of physical love to bring forth a human being created in His image that has never existed before or since, with a soul for eternity. And what our culture does, what the sexual revolutionaries do, is carve return to sender into their corpses and throw them back in His face. And when we think about this, and we think about this really hard, imagine how many babies are appearing before the throne of God on a daily basis. We get upset when we have to see one abortion picture. Imagine how many corpses God has to look at. And when we are Christian men, pro-life men, who have failed our culture in many ways, we have to get down on our knees and ask God to break our hearts for what breaks His. Because the way He addresses child sacrifice in the Old Testament is absolutely scary to read. If you look at how He talks about the ancient Ammonites and the ancient Moabites and the ancient Israelites when they fell, sacrificing their children to Molech, He said it was a sin so grave it had not even entered His mind. Never even entered the mind of God. Now what's the difference between the ancient Ammonites and us? The ancient people sacrificed their children to their gods because it was the most valuable thing they could give their God. We chuck our children in the trash because we think they mean nothing. We're worse than they are. And I think that we should keep that in mind when we're approaching this issue. I also want to address the pornography issue one more time as a way that we need to be pro-life men, Christian men in our culture. One of the reasons there are so few men in the pro-life movement is precisely because of this problem. It's because men are ashamed, and rightfully so. It's because men are tied to this problem, and they feel like they can't be a voice in the church, they can't be a voice in the pro-life movement, they can't be a voice in other non-profit organizations, because if they can't fight their own demons, they certainly can't fight the demons of the culture. And there is a bit of truth to that. But I've had many friends who come to me and share with the fact that they are struggling with pornography, and they ask, is there a way out of this? Absolutely there is. What does the Bible tell us about our demand? It says that we need to fight sin, which is one of the reasons that I get very tired of the language of struggling and addiction, because it's not used anymore to describe the problem, it's used as an excuse. There's an anti-porn group called Every Man's Struggle. I dislike that name. It's not Every Man's Struggle. And it shouldn't be either. We can't accept the status quo where everybody has a little lust problem, and that our lust problem involves sexually cannibalizing women on our computers and on our phones and on our iPads. When people say addiction, they seem to remove willpower from the equation and say, well, I'm addicted, I can't help it. Of course you can help it. There's an accountability program. Add your mother to that accountability program so she gets your internet history every week. How many girls are you going to look at on your computer when you know your mom's getting the emails? None. I know 3 people who quit porn cold turkey because they just added somebody to that end. You can quit if you're trying hard enough. You get to say you're struggling if you are struggling. But struggling isn't just a word to describe that you're going to trip and fall and you're going to mess up quite a bit. Struggling is the word you get to use when you're fighting porn with everything you have. And if you're struggling with it, I have seen so many people get free of porn. This is not about saying if you've looked at pornography, you can't be a help for the pro-life movement. On the contrary, I've seen people beat the porn addiction and they come out of it stronger than before because they know they beat this with God's help. And if they can beat their own demons, they know they can help us fight the cultural demons. You can come out of pornography addiction stronger than you were before and more well-equipped to fight and more holy than you were before because you know what it's like to build virtue. Because virtue is not something you're born with. Virtue is a habit that you build. So make today the first day you don't look at porn. That's the beginning of a virtue. Make tomorrow, it's another day. And then a week, then a month, then you've got a habit. And suddenly you know what it's like to fight. Because we're told to fight. We're told to fight sin. First we fight our own sin, and then we try to fight the sin of the culture. That's just so necessary. So this is not about browbeating people and saying, look, if you've looked at porn and you've been sexually cannibalizing women, you've been consuming women for your own pleasure, that somehow you can't be involved in the pro-life movement. No, close your laptop, get an accountability filter, and come talk to me. I'll give you a sign. Everybody's welcome, especially people who have learned how to fight, because fighters are exactly what we need, because way too many babies are dying and way too many women are being hurt, and we need you on the front lines as well. Finally, I want to say, after all of this, and what might have sounded like a bit of a ranty lecture, I want each and every one of you to consider joining the pro-life movement. What are we called to do in today's culture? We are called to speak out for those who can't speak. We are called to fight for the helpless. We are called basically to reach out to our neighbors who are in imminent danger of death. Don't let yourself get distracted by sexual sins that you can overcome with God's help. Don't let yourself get castrated by pornography and incapable of doing what you need to do. Don't let these habits, don't let lifestyles, don't let certain things that our culture has sold you prevent you from living out the Great Commission, prevent you from living out what we're told to do in the Sermon on the Mount, and live out the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because one of the things that I've seen time and time again is that when men band together, when men stand up for the women in their life, stand up for the children in their life, stand up for the women and children in their friends' lives, unbelievable things can happen. I have seen so many minds changed. I have seen so many hearts changed. I've gotten to play with babies on the floor of our office that were scheduled to be aborted 20 minutes downtown. And I can tell you there is no greater feeling than that in your life. So whatever you're struggling with, however you're feeling, I want to tell you that we need to have courage, we need to have hope, we need to go in prayer to the Scriptures, and we need to stand up and fight for those who need us the most, because that's what we're demanded to do. So that's the presentation.